Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. Many of the classic progressive rock albums that were released in the late 1960s and early 70s were, of course, from British artists. But there were some notable artists from elsewhere on the European continent, from Italy, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, who also got into the act. Most of these bands, regrettably, did not see their albums released in North America. Some of these bands did not sing in English language, or it was noticeable that their singers had trouble singing in English. And so their music was not embraced by North American record companies and didn't find their way to Canada or to the United States. However, one band in particular broke that mold in that they were great musicians, were quite witty with their English language lyrics, and made their mark at a very fortuitous time in 1974 and 1975. That band is the German band Triumvirat. Triumvirat first was launched in 1969 in what was then West Germany, in the city of Cologne. Triumvirat's band leader was a classically trained keyboard player named Jurgen Fritz. Jurgen Fritz was very much in the mold of Keith Emerson. He was classically trained, loved jazz music, and was very proficient on piano, Hammond organ, and the Moog synthesizer. He partnered with a very good jazz-oriented drummer who was also the band's lyricist, Hans Bathelt, and together with the bass player Werner Frangenberg, launched the initial version of the band. Triumvirat in its early days was a borderline clone of the Nice and later of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. In fact, they would often play songs like the Nice's version of Dave Brubeck's Rondo on stage, and do so very convincingly. Werner Frangenberg would leave the band after a time and was replaced by a different bassist who also provided lead vocals, named Hans-Georg Papi. And in 1972, Triumvirat launched their recording career, signing with EMI Electrola Records in Germany, who placed them on EMI's Harvest label. Triumvirat's first album, Mediterranean Tales, was released in 1972. This was a concept album with a sweet long piece of music on side one. Most of the singing on the album was done by Hans Papi, with Jurgen Fritz also taking the occasional lead vocal. The album was not released in North America, but it was a good enough record and performed well enough in Western Europe to where American record executives with EMI and their American affiliate Capitol Records kept an eye on it. Triumvirat began making their second album in 1973. During the making of the second album, Hans Papi became engaged and made the decision to leave the group. He was replaced by Jurgen Fritz's cousin, Helmut Koehlen, who was an accomplished bassist who also played guitar and had a very distinctive singing voice. Koehlen's singing voice was in the upper register, not unlike that of Greg Lake and of John Wetton, which gave even more credibility to those critics who would call Triumvirat the German ELP at the time. With Helmut Koehlen in the band, Triumvirat finished their second album, the album that would be their breakthrough, Illusions on a Double Dimple. Illusions contained two sweet long tracks. Side one of the album was the title track, Illusions on a Double Dimple, which was divided into 6 distinct pieces but was delivered without interruption over the course of some 22 minutes. There are some brilliant pieces of music embedded in the suite. In particular, there's an instrumental piece called Triangle, which is absolutely wonderful, tremendous performance by Jurgen Fritz with some interesting editing in order to bring his prowess on various keyboard instruments to the fore. Illusions tells the tale of a working class man who is wrongly accused of stealing money from his company and who is subsequently fired and drowns himself in alcohol as a result. The second side of the Illusions album is a suite lamenting the state of the music business. It's called Mr. 10%, and its primary characters are agents, hence the name Mr. 10%, greedy record company executives, and groupies. It, like side one, is also a terrific listen. While the lengthy tracks that were banded but performed without breaks on either side of the album meant that the album didn't get a lot of airplay in North America except on late night radio, it was a record that became very well known by word of mouth. Triumvirat was also able to land a spot during 1974 opening shows for the then current version of Fleetwood Mac, featuring Christine McVie and Bob Welch. One can only wonder how this heavy keyboard-driven music was accepted by the people who were coming to watch that version of Fleetwood Mac with their singer-songwriter approach. But the album, regardless of the possible mismatch between Triumvirat and Fleetwood Mac on stage, nevertheless did fairly well, peaking at number 45 on the US Billboard charts. EMI Records in the States saw this performance and thought that there would be a good opportunity for Triumvirat to really hit the ground running with their third album. In 1974, the real Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as it were effectively on hiatus. They had just completed their brain salad surgery tour and had begun taking what would be a 2.5-year-long break from touring and largely from recording too. So this gave Triumvirat a unique opening in the marketplace in order to be able to present their music. EMI Records took advantage of it. Triumvirat's third album, Spartacus, released in 1975, pulled out all the stops. This was a full-length concept album about the slave uprising in ancient Rome, led by the slave Spartacus. And it's masterfully done, with some great playing from Jurgen Fritz and some great drumming and especially great and witty lyrics from Hans Batholt. One of the key pieces of music on Spartacus is a multi-part suite of some 6 minutes long called The School of Ancient Pain, which discusses the plight of Roman gladiators. The tagline of that song is one that always makes me smile upon hearing it. If you can manage to come back alive, tomorrow's big fight is at 3. Spartacus received significant support from EMI Records, particularly from a promotional perspective from Capitol Records in the States. The album was recorded in Germany, but the decision was made to give the album a good commercial gloss, to have it mixed in London at George Martin's Air Studios. George Martin's protege from his days at Abbey Road, Jeff Emmerich, was the lead engineer on the project, assisted by a junior engineer who in the upcoming years would make a big contribution of his own on albums from Jeff Beck, Supertramp, and Rush, among others, that being Peter Henderson. Following the making of Spartacus, Helmut Koehlen made the decision to leave Triumvirat. He had had a taste of stardom and was interested in embarking on a solo career. Jurgen Fritz was committed to make several more albums for EMI, and so he soldiered on looking for a replacement vocalist, finding one in the British vocalist Barry Palmer, and began writing songs for Triumvirat's fourth album with Palmer's voice in mind. Interestingly, along the way, Helmut Quillen came to the decision that he could perhaps pursue both a solo career and still remain with Triumvirat, and came back asking Jurgen Fritz if he could rejoin. And Fritz was willing, but upon discovering that Fritz was writing music that was better suited to Barry Palmer's voice than to his own, Helmut Quillen stepped away again, this time for good. With Barry Palmer joining the band, and with original bassist Werner Frangenberg rejoining, Triumvirat created and released their fourth album, Old Loves Die Hard, in 1976. Old Loves Die Hard was the first album from the band that did not contain a very lengthy suite of music. It did contain some relatively long songs. It was a prog rock album, after all. But it did not have an ongoing theme throughout the record. It also came off as being a bit delicate. Barry Palmer's voice was in a significantly higher register than Helmut Quillen's was, and as a result was probably not a fit to what was happening on the radio airwaves in 1976, which by that time, both disco music and punk rock music were beginning to emerge from a commercial perspective and taking a lot of airspace that would otherwise have been available to bands like Triumvirat. The album thus was a relative failure, and this version of Triumvirat would break up. Jurgen Fritz, however, still had albums he needed to deliver under his contract with EMI. In early 1977, he began putting together a new album under the Triumvirat banner. It was not truly a band album, insofar as that it was really Jurgen Fritz running a project and hiring musicians to help him with the work in the studio. Barry Palmer was hired as a session musician to sing on the album. To provide bass and drums, Jurgen Fritz hired the rhythm section of the German fusion band Passport, drummer Kurt Kress and bassist Dieter Peterit, and created an album called Pompeii about the decline and ultimately the destruction of that city, with the album taking the form of a full-length concept album, beginning with the earthquake that hit upon Pompeii in 62 AD, and then the eruption of Mount Vesuvius some 17 years later. Sadly, during the making of Pompeii, in early May of 1977, Helmut Quillen died. The circumstances of his death are somewhat sketchy. What is known, however, is that he died by carbon monoxide poisoning in a closed garage with his car engine running, apparently as he was listening to a cassette mix of his solo album, which was near ready for release at the time. People have speculated over the years whether Quillen's death was a suicide. It would certainly appear to be, given its circumstances. And I know that Scott Lade, on his channel, the PROG Corner, has very distinctly referred to it as a suicide. I can't say that I've heard that anywhere else. In any event, Quillen's death was a sad footnote to the Triumvirat story. In retrospect, Triumvirat, I think, probably could have gone further as a band had Quillen stayed with the band longer than he did. Once again, this album was a relative failure in the commercial marketplace. Even more so than Old Loves Die Hard, it was a very delicate album, with Jurgen Fritz relying heavily on string synthesizers and on the upper register of Barry Palmer's voice. As a result, this would be the last album of a progressive vein that Triumvirat would pursue. They would, however, make two more albums. Their sixth album released in 1978, à la carte, was something of a hodgepodge. Fritz wanted to maintain a progressive edge with some of the music, and does include on the album a couple of longer progressive tracks. One of those, called A Bavarian in New York, received a fair amount of airplay in the greater New York area, where I was living at the time, although generally that was in the late night or early morning hours. But EMI wanted hits. They wanted to find a way to get music on the radio. And so some of the songs were, to a degree, forced down Jurgen Fritz's throat. Probably the most notable of these that made it to the album was a cover of the old Beach Boys tune, Darlin', which is, quite frankly, a bit regrettable. EMI also tried in this period to inject new blood into Triumvirat that could bring them hits. One of the musicians that they tried to convince Jurgen Fritz to include in the band was an American singer-songwriter by the name of Doug Fager, who stayed with Triumvirat for a time, although does not appear on à la carte. Fager's music was not to Fritz's taste, and they agreed to separate. But Fager had gotten the attention of some of the executives at EMI. Within a year, Doug Fager would make it big, albeit briefly, on the charts on a worldwide basis with his power pop band, The Knack. The Knack, obviously, being a far cry from progressive rock as most of us view it. Triumvirat would make one more album in 1980 called Russian Roulette. This album relied significantly on American session musicians from Los Angeles, and quite frankly is better off forgotten. The Triumvirat story doesn't end completely there, though. Jurgen Fritz would stay on the scene in Germany as a session musician, playing on various people's records, including making an appearance on one single by Barry Palmer in the middle 1980s. Interestingly, in the new millennium, Jurgen Fritz became interested in reviving the Triumvirat brand. He launched a website to promote his project, which he called The Website Story, and had written enough new music where he felt that with the proper financial backing that he could release an album in 2002. The album, unfortunately, never materialized. Jurgen Fritz was not able to find record company backing for the project, which would have been needed back in that time frame to handle recording, engineering, editing, and overdubs. And so the project pretty much died on the vine. Sadly, the website that was created in support of the project still exists, at least as far as that its homepage and URL are some 20-odd years later still active. Most of the links on the page, however, are dead. It is unfortunately a sad epitaph to this band that deserves to be remembered in a far better vein than that. For those of you listening who have not heard of or explored Triumvirat's music before, I would suggest that the two albums that they made during Emerson, Lake and Palmer's hiatus from the music business, Illusions on a Double Dimple and Spartacus, are the right place to start. They are both commercially minded in their approach, but more importantly, the musicianship and the songwriting are very, very strong. They are very worthy progressive albums and deserved to be successful on a worldwide basis. If you like those two albums, Mediterranean Tales is probably your next stop. And depending upon your taste, Old Loves Die Hard and Pompeii are both decent albums in terms of the approach that was taken. I don't personally listen to them as frequently as I listened to their first three, but they are worthy albums to the catalog. Other than for A Bavarian in New York, à la carte can be left on the side, and again, the less said about Russian Roulette, unfortunately, the better. That one, unfortunately, was the case of a record company trying to force an artist into a box that he just didn't belong in. Anyway, that is the story of Triumvirat, at least from my perspective. Feel free to leave comments if you have something to add to the story, or if you have other insights you'd like to share. If you don't agree with my assessment of their music, you can, of course, make comments there on that basis as well. As always, please click like on the episode, and if you haven't already subscribed to Progpaganda, please do. We're always looking to create new and diverse material around the progressive rock space. And the more viewers we have and the more input we have from you, the better we can achieve that goal. Anyway, thanks again, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.